In the 19th century, a Belgian astronomer and statistician decided that he was going to take his love for statistics. Just kidding. I'm not going to do that to you. Plenty of videos have been made about how bad BMI is at measuring obesity, but I think there's a larger discussion about why we're measuring obesity in the first place. I mean, why do we care about obesity? Part 1. The AMA statement 10 years later. Is obesity a disease? According to the American Medical Association, as of 2013, it is. This comes after decades of its denial as a disease and a slow shift of the medical community's perceptions towards it becoming a disease. But what exactly is a disease? According to the Encyclopedia Britannica, disease is a harmful deviation from normal structure and function. Normal here meaning homeostasis, the complex balance of physical and chemical processes which maintain the body's functioning. This deviation then is a breakdown of our anatomy and subsequently our physiology to the point that it causes harm. It's important to note the complexity of homeostatic balance. As the encyclopedia relates, while death is almost always due to heart or lung failure, the processes that lead up to that are diverse and multifactorial. So then if we take an established disease such as diabetes, we can generally say that it involves the breakdown of blood sugar balance, with a lack of insulin to respond to blood sugar and or reduced cellular sensitivity to insulin, preventing cellular uptake. Thus, the structures that comprise the pancreas and the cellular insulin receptors are damaged in such a way that it affects glucose or blood sugar transport. This then leads to many harmful effects down the line when high blood sugar begins impacting blood vessels and nerves. So along what lines did the AMA justify their decision to label obesity as a disease? It's an interesting article in Endocrinology and Metabolism Clinics of North America from 2016, which examined the evolution of obesity's disease status. In a 2008 report from the Obesity Society leading up to the AMA's decision, the authors note that they couldn't really establish a scientific explanation to justify obesity as a disease because of a lack of a clear, widely accepted definition of disease. Our social definition of disease will remain contentious, however, because values vary and because the label disease changes judgments about the moral status of people with various conditions and their rights to medical and social resources. Here they are recognizing the failure of language to delineate between something that is always a disease and another thing that is never a disease. Somewhat Wittgensteinian, I would say. So then on what basis did they justify their decision? Considering obesity a disease is likely to have far more positive than negative consequences and to benefit the greater good by soliciting more resources into research, prevention, and treatment of obesity, by encouraging more high-quality, caring professionals to view treating the obese patient as a vocation worthy of effort and respect, and by reducing the stigma and discrimination heaped upon many obese persons. And so the 2016 review comments that determining what is a disease is more of a social policy determination than a scientific one. To be fair to science, we should have at least some reason why obesity is worthy the designation as a disease. That is, we should have some sort of evidence of deviation from the normal structure and function. For this, we will turn our attention to a 2019 article in the Journal of Clinical Investigation examining the pathogenesis of fat or adipose tissue. Research over the past 10 to 20 years has expanded our understanding of adipose not just as a storage tissue, but also as an endocrine one, communicating with other tissues via hormones, inflammatory mediators, signaling lipids, and some cool little critters called microRNA. These complex processes create a large signaling network that is central to metabolic homeostasis. Metabolic homeostasis here refers to that of blood sugar, cholesterol, and blood pressure levels. Interestingly, it has been found that fat tissue pathology is associated not only with disorders of excess fat, like obesity, but also fat loss or lipodystrophy. In this review, we get two important figures for our discussion. The first, figure 1, shows the different types of adipose tissue, white, brown, and beige. The picture here, however, divides the types of fat more so by location, differentiating the subcutaneous white adipose tissue, the adipose tissue just under the skin, from the visceral white adipose tissue, which is found in the abdominal cavity. According to the review, subcutaneous white adipose tissue has no adverse effects and may actually be protective against metabolic disorders, evidenced by lower cardiovascular risk in persons with subcutaneous obesity, regardless of whether they have visceral obesity. Meanwhile, obesity of visceral why adipose tissue, more commonly known as abdominal or central obesity, is associated with insulin resistance and increased risk for metabolic disease. And now we'll draw our attention to figure 2, showing the pathological development of adipose tissue. The main thing I want to impress upon you is the different types of cells which are involved in this inflammatory process. This includes inflammatory cells like macrophages and vascular cells, which enable blood flow throughout the tissue. All right, so it seems like we may have a pathophysiological basis for obesity, but the exact mechanism, as the paper goes on to explain, isn't clear. Which, to be fair, the exact mechanism for most diseases isn't clear, but the paper does impress upon one the gap in knowledge of the causal mechanism of obesity. So then if we compare obesity to a well-established disease like diabetes, in which you can measure someone's A1C, their average blood sugar over the past 6 months, and say either yes, they have the disease, or no, they don't, what is the measure of fat mass that would correlate to obesity? The problem is we don't really have one. While at one point 20% of ideal body weight was considered obesity, that metric has largely fallen out in favor of part 2, BMI. So the problem with BMI and obesity is that we run into some circular logic. What does a BMI of 30 indicate? Obesity. How do we clinically measure obesity? Why, a BMI of 30, of course. How did we come up with 30, though? Well, that's a somewhat long story, but basically it comes down to a decision by the World Health Organization based on studies and insurance data completed before the mid-90s. As we all know from various video essays and articles out there on BMI, it was based on a mid-19th century report from a Belgian man studying the average bodies of men in Europe at the time. It was revitalized in the early 70s by Ansel Keys as a proxy for determining fatness. The accuracy of its health categories doesn't hold well across age, sex, and ethnicity. BMI is getting canceled, didn't you hear? But BMI isn't wrong. As accurately as one can measure them, it does provide accurate and precise information about weight independent of height. The problem comes when we try to determine health risks, especially when using arbitrarily imposed categories like normal weight, overweight, and obese. At a BMI above 35 and below 18, there is evidence for increased mortality risk. But even then, we have to recognize BMI's role in the study of population health as compared to its role in determining the health of an individual patient. However, the overarching role of BMI in our current medical paradigm comes with a modern tale of power and knowledge. Enter Foucault. Echoing the hierarchical imbalances suggested by the modern-day recognition of the widespread male gaze, Foucault introduces his concept of the medical or clinical gaze in 1963's The Birth of the Clinic. He describes how the push for empiricism, that is, observation and measurement, at all aspects of the broader modern scientific paradigm has led to, in medicine, the separation of the patient as a body from the patient as a human. This medical gaze legitimizes power dynamics between provider and patient, permitting the objective assessment of individual health by noting symptoms and situating them in a continuum of known departures from the biological norm. Thus, the importance of BMI in our current medical paradigm reflects the more general tendency for science-based societies to privilege statistical evidence in measuring and defining health. Regimes of truth, for example, accepted scientific knowledge, are a function of power relations among individuals and institutions. Okay, Foucault, thank you. You can go now. Reducing a patient to a compilation of numbers in a chart and placing those numbers higher up the information hierarchy than the patient's self-reported health directly leads to situations where medical conditions go undiagnosed. It might seem dramatic when I say no one knows what obesity is, but honestly, I don't think this is too far from the case for most people, especially when you consider the fact that I learned little to none of the nuance with weight and health during my 4 years at the number 5 pharmacy school in the nation. After all is said and done, where does this leave us? What should we know about obesity going forward? First off, what is obesity? Is there such a thing as a disease of excess fat? As disease is understood within the modern medical paradigm, yes. There is evidence that increasing BMI over 35 leads to an increased risk for mortality, which is causally explained by inflammatory process involved in the pathology of certain phenotypes of fat accumulation, most notably visceral white adipose tissue. Where should we draw the line for obesity? The current cut point of a BMI of 30 doesn't seem to hold the same validity based on mortality data from studies completed in the past 20 years. Overall, using BMI to diagnose obesity is dubious because of the variation in its correlation to health across diverse demographics. I think that until further information on the causal path of obesity is clear, we'll have to accept a more informal definition of obesity based on multiple factors, including measures such as waist circumference, patient-reported health, and biomarkers of metabolic health. In this regard, we can't rely on discrete cutoffs for disease classification like we can with other diseases such as diabetes, which is okay. I would hope that the discussion of BMI in Part 2 impressed upon you the need to understand health from a broader and more patient-centered approach, rather than one focused on the chart as surrogate for the patient. I don't think diagnoses should be made without some form of practitioner-patient interaction. To this end, academic healthcare programs need to continue to reinforce patient-centered care as the foundation of what we do, but also to recognize the ease with which we, as healthcare professionals, can slip into the medical gaze. And then what is the role of BMI in understanding obesity? As an epidemiological measure of overall population health, BMI can describe the relationship between weight and health, especially with changes over time. When applying the average health of an entire population based on one measure to a single individual, however, it fails to capture their health as a complex culmination of a multitude of factors. To use the words of one of the authors above, we need to strip BMI of its privileged status as quantified data which do not lie, akin to biomarkers such as blood pressure, blood sugar, and cholesterol, and instead reclassify it as a holistic measure of health relative to weight. Achieving this requires an ideological shift by health researchers who must become more critical of BMI use in surveys, models, and as evidence for interventions and policies. As a society, we need to come to a better understanding of what these labels, fat, health, and obesity mean before just using them indiscriminately. Much of my research these past 2 months has been driven by my own internalized weight bias and how I look out at the world. So I would call upon everyone who made it this far to do the same and question your own foundational beliefs about weight. Weight stigma has been called one of the last acceptable forms of prejudice in our society, and the time to end it was yesterday.